So hello everyone who has already joined us and who's in the process of getting in right now. I'll go ahead and start us off since it's just 1 o'clock now. If folks join as we're going, that's absolutely fine. My name is Sarah Taylor and I'm the Associate Registrar for Recruitment at Nipissing University. I'm basically just here to help moderate throughout. I'll be here in the beginning. I'm going to turn my camera and voice off while Dr. Connor does the lecture, and then afterwards I'll come back on and we'll see if folks have any questions. Just a reminder to the folks who are joining as guests, your videos are turned off and your microphones are turned off, and we're going to leave it that way for the duration of the lecture. But you do have a little chat button in the bottom. If you don't see it right away, there might be a little purple button you can press in the bottom right. That'll open it up so that you have a chat. If you have any questions or anything you want to let us know while Dr. Connor is lecturing, you can feel free to write them in the chat because I'll be in there kind of monitoring it as we go, so feel free to use that. And then at the end, if you have any questions, we'll probably do it through chat, at least to start at first as well. Okay, so I will pass it over. I'm going to turn my stuff off. Steve, you can maybe introduce yourself and your lecture, and then I think we're okay to go ahead and get started.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Sarah. I do appreciate that. Hello to everyone. This is a completely new experience for me, and I assume it is for you. So thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to join in on this. Just by way of introduction, my name is Dr. Steve Connor. I'm a history professor at Nipissing. I teach modern history with a focus on the military past. And in September, I will be teaching courses in military history, a first-year Great War course and a World War II, history of World War II courses. So some of the things that I say today are going to seep into those discussions. But today it's pretty focused. So I want to give you a sense of where my own research lies, as well as some of the ways that historians have thought about the military past. Military history is not that it has changed considerably in the last 25 years, and part of that has to do with understanding the context and societies from which military institutions and war itself springs. And I want to take two interests that I have. One is in sequential art, what we call comic books, and the other is the military past. And I want to focus on a few specific things today. So let's get started. In December of 1940, Adolf Hitler finally got what was coming to him. That's a punch face. Now, of course, it wasn't delivered in the real world, but on the cover of Captain America Comics #1. This comic premiered Steve Rogers, a new fictional superhero that was dubbed Captain America. He was created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, two Jewish Americans from New York City. Now, the first issue alone sold nearly 1 million copies, despite the fact that in 1940, the US still remained neutral in the Second World War. Throughout this war, comic books as a form of propaganda reached millions of readers every month and played a vital role in explaining who the enemy was, what they were like, and how they should be treated. Well, comics certainly transmitted that message, as well as the message that freedom was worth fighting for and that Germany and Japan would not stop the war. They also possessed a very dark side. To defeat the enemy in many ways, we had to become just like them. Comic books then serve as a useful starting point to consider the intersection of war, popular culture, and history. To more fully explore and understand their role in the context of World War II, this lecture today asks and answers three key questions. What roles did comic books play in depicting a mythical version of total war? In what ways was the enemy, whether German or Japanese, categorized, and why? And finally, what were the consequences and effects of enemy depictions in the context of racialized violence and war? Now, let's start in the very beginning of the comic book with, let's call him the unironic illegal alien. Now, undoubtedly, it's true that stories told with a series of words and pictures have been around for a very long time. in the format that we recognize today, probably since the 1500s. However, the comic book, as we know it today, only really began in the late 1930s. Now, in June of 1938, DC Comics published Action Comics #1, or at least that was the cover date. And that featured the first appearance of Superman. Escaping a dying planet as a baby, young Clark, his adoptive Earth name, crash landed in rural Midwestern America. There he would be raised by Ma and Pa Kent, simple country folk who instilled in him the virtues of truth, justice, and the American way. Superman and Clark Kent, his mild-mannered alter ego, were in essence a displaced person, a refugee, in fact, an illegal alien. But Superman was also the quintessential idealized newcomer made good, the creation of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, both from Jewish immigrant families. Superman was then intended to represent everything good about America and about humanity, namely truth and justice. Of course, Superman became popular in the late 1930s for many reasons. Perhaps most significantly, akin to many Americans, Superman was himself an immigrant, even if that was from an alien world. But Superman too understood what a profound gift he'd been given and lived out, protected, personified even, the American virtues of hard work, justice, and truth, or at least their idealized versions, even as the United States itself struggled through the harsh realities of the Great Depression. The character and, more importantly, sales of his comic book exploded. Other publishers, of which there were scores, were anxious to capitalize, as the newsstands across North America were awash in crime-busting comic books. At the dawn of what we now call the golden age of superhero comic books, characters including the Human Torch, Batman, the Submariner, Wonder Woman, Captain Marvel, basically a Superman knockoff, the Shield, and Captain America quickly entered an increasingly crowded field. Interestingly, in this first wave of superhero comic books, stories themselves rarely pitted the Caped Crusaders against equally colorful foes, the supervillains as we now call them. Rather, tied intimately to the context of economic and political turmoil of the Great Depression, bad guys were most often organized criminals, gangsters, and perhaps surprisingly, unscrupulous capitalists, business tycoons, and American robber barons, eager to exploit and rob at the expense of honest, hardworking Americans. But by the early 1940s, while evil remained, the villains would change. As in September of 1939, the Great Depression ended and the world again plunged into a global war. Now, unsurprisingly, comic book publishers, either eager to retain their market share and most certainly to reflect the, quote, real world of which their fanciful characters existed, also began to tell stories connected to the wars in Europe and in Asia. But also bear in mind that while World War II had begun in Europe in 1939 and even earlier in China, it was not until the end of 1941 that the United States actually ended its neutrality and entered the war to fight against Germany and Imperial Japan. Yet even before the United States had officially entered the war, many superheroes were already fighting it in the pages of monthly comic books. Here I think it's also critical to remember that this first generation included pioneers such as Alan Bellman, Bob Kane, and Bill Finger, the creators of Batman, Joe Simon and Jakob Kurtzberg, also known as Jack Kirby, and Stanley Lieber, Stan Lee, the godfathers of the Marvel Universe. Importantly, as Jewish Americans and often from immigrant families, these creators hope to influence the United States, hope to influence decision-making about the war, and use their creative platform to urge Americans to enter the war, just as their creations had done in the pages of the comic books. In fact, a full 9 months before the entry into the war, Captain America, garbed in the patriotic red, white, and blue, espoused not only the ideals of American nationalism, but gave Adolf Hitler a sock in the jaw. Now, of course, not all Americans understood nor even feared the threat of Nazism. Indeed, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby actually received hate mail penned by readers who were opposed to such storylines in Captain America. Yet in the aftermath of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, an American entry into the war in December of 1941, Captain America's views and actions about evil and what to do about it became the norm. In short, even prior to American involvement in the war, comic books were an important way to influence the public's view. It is true that in the late 1930s and early 1940s, comic books were seen very differently than they are today, and intended and marketed for primarily children and undereducated adults. And unlike today, comic books themselves enjoyed a massive readership. Unsurprisingly then, as the United States entered the war, comics were seen as an important way to spread propaganda to a vast audience. In fact, the largest single customer for comic books in the United States in the 1940s was the United States military, with almost 50% of all service people being regular comic book readers. Throughout World War II, the popularity of comic books only continued to grow. For example, in 1941, 15 million comic books were published every month. By 1944, sales had grown to 25 million a month. Superman and Captain America alone each sold over 1 million copies every 30 days. Indeed, many combatants, many soldiers continued to buy comic books even after the war ended. As in 1947, for example, comic books sold 60 million issues a month. Now, originally, the American military sold comic books as a type of entertainment. Bear in mind that in the context of the Second World War, the American military, particularly those at the front line, were often drawn from the least educated and from the working classes and rural classes of the United States. But very soon, many servicemen became hooked on the storylines. They became hooked on the characters and their fight against evil enemies. In this context then of total war, comic books increasingly mimicked, in an idealized way of course, the real world of the readership. Fictional heroes reflected on why the war needed to be won, and the ways that everyone, whether a soldier or a child, could help to win it. They also clearly identified who the enemy was, and importantly, why they were so. My focus today then is on these last 2 points, what I call the dark side of comic books. Now, of course, there did exist a proverbial light side of comic books. Often this reflects the efforts to generate popular support for the war effort. Indeed, even a cursory look at the books themselves reveals that even the advertisements were war-related. But as I've said, my focus today is on the enemy. That is to say, anti-Japanese, anti-German images, depictions, and stories. Here we can explore the much darker messages that not only revealed the enemy, but also portrayed them as less than human, or in some cases, not human at all. Now, certainly we must historicize such characterizations and understand them in the context in which they existed. And we must also realize that the enemy in comics were overwhelmingly bit part players. Almost universally, their depiction, their relevance, and their significance had little to do with the overall narrative. After all, the protagonists, like the readership, were Americans. Rather, the enemy served other needs, most importantly, I think, as a confirmation of Washington's official telling of the war. To locate and consider the enemy in American comic books, let's start here with three important propositions. First, depictions of the enemy had different categories and different purposes. Secondly, depictions of the enemy were based on racialized tropes or racialized stereotypes. And thirdly, depictions were intentional and had important effects. Now, as I've already mentioned, in the Second World War, the United States, and for that matter, all the Allied powers, including Canada, were engaged in an existential struggle with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. That is to say, they could no longer coexist. Unsurprisingly, then, there are important shared features within the enemy. They're identifiable, relatively easy, and decoded. However, whatever the extent of the similarity, important differences and distinctions between enemies are equally in evidence. Let's start, however, with the shared attributes and depictions of the enemy. Now, despite a powerful argument that war does not have a right or wrong side, in the Second World War, both sides believed that they were absolutely right. American superheroes, as well as servicemen, were always shown in comic books as acting honestly, bravely, and heroically. They represented the side of good in a titanic battle against absolute evil. The Axis enemies were villains and depicted in many ways as opposite of the heroes and the values that they stood for. In general, then, comic books divided the enemy into two groups: leaders and followers, leaders and soldiers. Each of these groups had in their own way, demonstrated part of the reason why the Axis needed to be defeated. And so when we look at these two characteristics or these two groups individually, we can reassemble them together to get a total picture of why comic readers were told that the Axis needed to be defeated. Now, our first group here, as I said already, are the leaders. Now, here we're talking about Hitler in Germany, for example, Mussolini in Italy, Tojo in Japan. When they are depicted, when these figures, these known figures, are depicted in comics as the enemy leaders, they are either drawn as monsters or as fools. Now, when they're shown as monsters, their evil is obvious. It literally drips from the page. They could not be reasoned with, and they intended only to destroy, and they could be only defeated by war. These monsters, then, were often barely human, and so very different from those that fought against them. The other trope is that of the foolish leader that acted ridiculously and was shown as inherently weak and rather stupid. Such images, then, were intended to poke fun at enemy leaders, and in a way to also make fun of those who followed them. This, I think, leads us naturally to our next group, and that is the category of the enemy soldier. Now, it's fair to say that in comic books during the Second World War, the average soldier really didn't get that much attention. Very rarely, if ever, are they shown as individuals, and their only real job in the story was to follow orders and, by the end of the comic, to be soundly beat up by the heroes. Soldiers, then, were mostly depicted, even drawn, exactly the same. As a result, they weren't really individuals at all. And in every way, then, they were depicted as inferior to the hero. To show just how different and inferior the enemy was, comic books then relied on racialized stereotypes. This gave a particularly powerful coded understanding transmitted between the page and the reader. Now, as part of these depictions, many soldiers were drawn with animal-like features that, of course, dehumanized them. This is particularly true in the case of the Japanese. Now, in World War II era comic books, the Japanese acted as evil as they looked. They didn't even have to act, they just needed to look. In short, depictions were universal in their effort to portray the Japanese as inhuman. To that end, comics presented an enemy based on familiar, long-held, racialized attributes. Indeed, as the historian John Dower has noted, such representations of the bestial-Asiatic other not only dehumanized the enemy, but also contributed to the overwhelming racial violence in the Pacific theater. Such versions of the Japanese, of the Asian, of the quote Oriental, fit snugly into long-standing American, even North American fears and representations of the Orient and the quote yellow peril. In almost all wartime propaganda, comic artists anthropomorphized the Japanese enemies. Generally, this included rat-like features, such as buck teeth and sloped eyes, and oftentimes thick eyeglasses. In comic books, the villains' actions were equally as brutal, and they conformed to a set of recognizable tropes as inscrutable, yet physically weak and cowardly. In short, the Japanese were sneaky and untrustworthy. Not only had they attacked the United States without warning, but also were shown as liars and natural subversives, inherently disloyal, even if they were American citizens. In effect, then, the creators depicted the enemies whose words and deeds were as diabolical as their ideology, or even as diabolical as their race. By presenting a range of specific visual and dialogue cues, then, creators established enemy otherness. Now, conveniently, tradition and familiar renderings of the Oriental as inscrutable, as insidious, meshed well with other characteristics of the Japanese. So, for example, when the Japanese took the Pacific by storm in the first half of 1942, it became very difficult for them to be simply presented as a weakling. And so the monster became outsized. The yellow monkey, the quote-unquote yellow monkey that we see in this panel, became the yellow gorilla, if you will, that would strike without warning. But even then, I should say, lacked the guts for a fair fight. To this end, enemies were universally brutal and strong only so long as they attacked from ambush. Ultimately, they would be defeated. They would be rather handily defeated at the end of the story, no matter the odds, by the brains, but more commonly the brawn of the American superhero. Now, it is true that the Japanese were also depicted as utterly comical and in some ways even incompetent. They shouted nonsensical slogans. They spoke English with a strong accent. They were depicted as physically weak, small, and often clumsy. To counter this, there would be the baboon-like figure or the gorilla figure, himself rather silly. The message here was clear. Japanese culture, too, was funny, silly, and ultimately inferior. Now, of course, comic books employed stereotypes to show the enemy as dangerous because they were bestial, because they were brutal, because they were untrustworthy. But it also showed them as laughable and different in almost every way from us. Regardless of whether the Japanese were depicted as vicious monsters or comical buffoons, they were at heart inferior, and they deserved defeat, even in the case of the war in the Pacific, even if that meant killing every last one of them. Put simply, in the context of World War II comic books, the Japanese were the enemy because they were Japanese. Let's turn now to consider the Germans. The Germans, of course, were also an enemy. Indeed, if we look at the strategy, at the overall prosecution of the Second World War, all Allied powers considered Germany to be their primary foe in the Second World War. However, in general, when creators depicted Germans in comic books, they relied less on the overt racialized stereotypes so common in depictions of the Japanese. Yet in some ways, they were very much similar. Primarily, I think this is in regard to what we see as the willingness in both enemy populations to surrender their individuality, to surrender to the lure of groupthink. Now, there's an important distinction here, I think. In the case of the German enemy, this is the collective psychosis of Nazism. Critically, it's important to see here that Germans engaged in this conversion to Nazism due to some pathological shortcomings, rather than the supposed racial characteristics so common to the Japanese. What this means then is that the Germans willingly surrendered their capacity to determine right from wrong or good from evil. Germans then were not born enemies, so to speak. And this then allowed space for notions of the quote-unquote good German and the related bad Nazi, a trope that was entirely impossible for the Japanese. To that end, then, and despite the reality that Nazi Germany held most of Europe under its murderous boot heel and systematically murdered millions who failed to meet their pseudo-scientific Aryan racist standard, comic books tended to poke fun at notions of German superiority. They offered characterizations then that stood in stark contrast. Now, this started, of course, at the very top with Hitler himself, who was always weak and always portrayed as cowardly. In comic book panels, he ducked the manly art of fisticuffs. He never fought his own battles. And when, inevitably, he was challenged, he elected to hide behind his throne or behind his bodyguards. Universally, then, Adolf Hitler behaved irrationally. He threw temper tantrums and yelled, again in stilted English, his dialogue limited to exclamations, lies, and rants. Hitler, while always a dangerous monster, was also weak, insane, slightly effeminate, and silly. In effect, he was everything that superheroes were not. Doing Hitler's work were his generals and his foot soldiers. And these two were based on familiar stereotypes, images, and tropes, often, in fact, recycled from the propaganda of the Great War. For example, the German military officer was mostly drawn, or often drawn, complete with monocle, probably a dueling scar indicating his Prussian lineage, and his chest draped with medals and awards that he clearly did not deserve. He was arrogant, and petty, and mean, but cowardly, easily fooled, and similar to the Japanese, never fought fair. The plans of the generals were always foiled when opposed by brave heroes fighting fairly for freedom and justice. And I think here it's important to also acknowledge that within the pages of comic books, there remained a place for the child hero and for the female hero. But when we're focused more on villains, we see again, similar to the Japanese, that the common German soldier himself also suffers from this dehumanization process. For example, they're often called Razzies, a play on Nazi. They were never represented as individuals, and they always attacked in a kind of rat-like swarm, thoughtlessly rushing towards the flying fists of the story's protagonist. Hitler's henchmen, then, were mindlessly committed to follow orders and unwilling or unable to think for themselves. Of course, German soldiers were brutal and cruel. And while perhaps not as obvious in terms of the racialized images as we've seen with the Japanese, Germans too were clearly an enemy and very different from the Allies. It's critically important at this point, I think, to acknowledge that comic book propaganda was not official propaganda. That is to say, propaganda created by the American government. Powerfully too, comics at this time were uncensored. They could then be incredibly violent and racist in ways that official types of propaganda had to avoid. Front cover, as you see, of exciting comics featuring the Black Terror, literally running over foxhole Japanese is tame by comparison to some of the violence. Indeed, comic books as a form of aggressive and racialized violence demonstrates a kind of propaganda that even the American government needed to appear to be uninvolved with. Captain America comics, for example, proved incredibly violent, even by today's standard, as characters were shot in the face, beaten, and tortured. Yet, Captain America himself always fought by the rules of war, and ultimately triumphed, while violent, evil enemies always cheated and lost. Certainly, both the impact and the intention of this form of propaganda was not just telling a good, entertaining story, or indeed to sell comics. As unofficial propaganda, that in fact was part of the dynamic here, to sell comic books. That being said, comic books intentionally dehumanized the enemy, and in ways changed how readers viewed and treated them, whether in combat or far from the battlefield, in the communities of the home front. Comic book images and depictions then were intentional, they were well rehearsed, and they were almost casual in their widespread acceptance. I suggest then that they did have important effects. First, comics taught readers who the enemy was, and also taught them to hate them. Secondly, while the enemy leaders were often shown as responsible for the war, comics also showed that the Axis countries themselves, that is to say, their very people, were also responsible. And just as heroes defeated our enemies and foiled their insidious plots, so too would Allied forces need to kill and conquer our enemies in the real world. Third, comic books presented an enemy that, while weak and inherently inferior, might still be threatening and dangerous. Yet, collectively, enemies, whether soldiers, supervillains, or the general population, were also irrational, and too often less than human. If the enemy was to be seen as an animal, especially a violent and unpredictable one, then they would need to be fought and killed until they changed their ways. And comic books encourage their readers, whether a child or a soldier, to do just that. Comic books then, as propaganda, were intended to contribute to the violence of war. And as we've seen, they provided readers with a specific set of psychological and cultural resources, empowering them to see the enemy as inhuman and to abide by their destruction. With 25 million copies published each month, they certainly were successful in spreading that message. So, what to make from all of this? Historically engaging with comic books and popular culture more generally promises to show us trends and beliefs and concerns of everyday life, of everyday people in North America. Comics tell stories that readers could understand and identify with at that time. In a way, then, comics are a kind of time capsule that tells us about the time in which they were published, such as the views, the opinions, the slangs, the values, the behaviors, assumptions, and attitudes about race and gender, for example. And here I don't mean just the stories, but even the letters to the editor or advertisements for products. It tells us about a particular time. Comic books then are a window into the past. But as with all history, understanding them as sources requires more than a critical eye and the ability to see both the similarities and the differences we today have with the past. Understanding comics and understanding history requires us to consider, to engage with, to immerse ourselves in wider contexts, and to ask not only what happened in the past, but why. In effect, then, careful study of the past requires an ability to historicize that, to understand the past on its own terms and from its own perspectives, however challenging and uncomfortable that might make us. The Second World War was not solely one of liberation. Indeed, the Allies certainly did not go to war to free Germans from the clutches of Nazism, nor the Japanese from the jingoistic ideology of the Emperor. Rather, defeating the Axis powers meant conquest, a reality largely obscured in post-war German and Japanese recollections, and I would argue collective memory. In effect, then, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan would not stop the war, would not stop their own industrial killing machines unless they were compelled to do so by force of arms. In short, the Second World War began as a result of authoritarian aggression in Europe and Asia, and could only be ended by destroying the enemy's will and ability to make war. This, I think, is worth remembering. However unsatisfactory, morally ambiguous Allied behavior certainly was, whether in battle or on the home front, as we've seen. In the dark days of World War II, the line between acceptable and unacceptable proved a blurred and treacherous one. Yet, that comic books racialized depictions of the enemies, and that these depictions made any sense to its readership at all, does raise important and I think rather questions about our own cultural values and norms in the last century. Comic books in the Second World War played an important role in interpreting that war for millions of readers, from kids to combatants, and encouraging the war effort and to see it to its successful conclusion. After all, Germany and Japan had to be defeated. And examining the ways that enemies were depicted, we find that stereotypes dominated wartime comic books. Comic books based their depictions of the enemy on dehumanizing, racialized stereotypes, leaving no doubt for the readers both who the enemy was and how they should be treated and how they would be defeated. Here, I think, lies the dark side of comic books, in which the virtues that superheroes claim to uphold of truth and justice are nowhere to be found. Thank you very much for your kind attention today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Steve.
Outstanding.
I think we might share a common interest here. That was really interesting. So thank you for that lecture. That was awesome.
Fantastic.
If anybody has any questions for either Steve as a professor or about the lecture that he gave, or for myself about the university in general, we can use the chat to ask those for now. We'll give it a minute and see if anyone has questions there.